For WorldatWork and WorkSpan TV, I'm Ryan Johnson. I'm joined in the studio today by Brent Longnecker and Chris Crawford of Longnecker Associates, and we're going to have a brief conversation about 2011 executive compensation trends. Brent, let me start off with you. One of the topics this year is comparators versus competitors. Can you just spend a minute talking about that?
Absolutely, Ryan. It's a really interesting issue out there because, one of the hardest things out there is dealing with peer groups. And you got a lot of companies out there that compete against companies that may be bigger or smaller than themselves, and so they start to ask themselves, well, why aren't they my peer group? Why aren't they my comparator? They're my competitor, but they might not necessarily be my comparator. One of the things that they have to be cognizant of is the fact that it's really about their size, where their revenue is, where their market cap is. And it's not bad if they're going to be growing as a company to actually go out maybe 2 or 3 years to see where they're going to be. But just because you might be working against somebody that's next door to you that's 5 times bigger doesn't mean that that's what you need to pay. Because when you're 5 times bigger, as we all know, from a comparator perspective, you're going to have a lot more responsibilities as a CEO. If you're not careful and you basically made all of your competitors a comparator, and that's a real tongue twister, you would actually have everybody getting paid top dollar very quick. And that would hurt executive pay practices out there. So I think that companies have to be very cognizant of the fact that there's a huge differentiator between somebody who is a competitor versus somebody that's a competitor in your space that's revenue driven or market capitalization driven.
Is this a big issue in the boardroom, Brent? Are a lot of people struggling with this?
Sure, Ryan. If you think about it, you're a CEO that's sitting there a little bit frustrated. You could be literally an oil and gas company that, you're competing with all the tracks around you are, British Petroleum, Exxon, Shell, and you're sitting in there, and although you might not be as big as them, they're really who you're competing with. You're going up and trying to get leases against them. You're trying to hire talent away from them. And that's a real interesting issue if you think about it, because you may have to pay your professional and technical the same that the bigger companies are paying. But when it comes time to those NEOs, the named executive officers, and that CEO, it's all about revenue and market cap and performance. And so you've got to be careful with that. So I understand the frustration and the dilemma, but you still got to have the motivation if you're that CEO or that NEO to grow your company to where it becomes more complex and one day your comparator is in fact your competitor.
Issue 2, let me turn to you, Chris. Say on pay, been a big issue obviously in the mainstream press in the last year or two. What's happening? What's the current state of say on pay?
It's interesting out there. I think there's some intended and unintended consequences of say on pay. So if you look out there and look at the companies, there have been 26 to date that have failed, and so I'm sure the government would say that's an intended consequence. And when you look inside the boardrooms at what is actually going on, there's a lot more discussion between board members and management as to what's right, what's fair, is our pay and performance connected like never before. So compensation committee meetings are taking much longer than they ever have before. So you'd say all intended consequences. But if you dig down a little, some of the unintended consequences of those 26 companies, I'm not sure you could say those 26 companies are the worst compensation practices in the country. What has happened is RiskMetrics, specifically ISS, has voted against those companies, and the shareholder makeup of those companies is more than 50% follow RiskMetrics, and they're voting against those companies say on pay practices, and they might not necessarily be bad, it's just they go counter to ISS's model. And so there's some unintended consequences. I'm sure you could find other companies out there that have egregious compensation packages, but because of their shareholder makeup, they may have voted for their compensation programs, not necessarily against because they don't follow ISS. I think another unintended consequence is companies are now looking at who their institutions are on a go-forward basis. So if you've got a company that's sitting there saying, we're going to go raise more equity or more cash through a secondary offering, and we're going to go get more institutions as shareholders, they're now asking them the question, do you follow ISS blindly? And if they say yes, they realize that those dollars have strings attached to them, i.e. a possible vote against them on say on pay, and so they may be looking somewhere else to go and get that money through a secondary offering. So some unintended consequence. I think ultimately it's been a fruitful venture. There's been a lot of people that have said, why are we doing this and is there real value in it? I think the net effect is there is some value, but there is definitely some unintended consequences with say on pay this year.
So this is basically year one. What are you predicting is going to happen in year two next year?
Not nearly as many failures I think you're realizing companies that have now gone through the whole process and realizing where the pitfalls or the landmines are, and they're going to be proactive in making sure they don't fail, say, on pay, one. So I think 26 or 30, however, whatever the net number is this year, you're going to see that go down in the future. I do think you're going to see more discussion of boards and companies looking at ISS's policies, right or wrong, and making decisions, do we want to follow them? I think you are going to see more pressure for pay for performance. You're going to see more companies diligent in their process and their methodology, just as Brent has talked about from a comparator and competitor standpoint, ensuring that they're reasonable in their compensation program. So all the things everyone's talking about from a media, from a government standpoint, from a governance standpoint, I think you're going to see companies take that a little more seriously going forward. You're going to see the outliers maybe drop back into a little more mainstream from a total amount or mix of pay. But I don't think you're going to see nearly as many companies fail, say, on pay on a go-forward basis.
Topic 3, Brent, let me turn back to you. What's happening with stock options?
You're seeing options used less and less. And if they're being used in conjunction with some of the more, I would say, retention-oriented plans, performance-oriented plans, like restricted stock is a great plan out there. Restricted stock units, restricted stock awards, performance share, performance unit plans are starting to really increase in nature out there as well because of the favorable accounting treatment that they finally got from FAS 123R. And so I think you're going to start to see that. I think people are getting more and more sophisticated with WorldatWork leading the charge on the importance of diversification. And people that came from the old school of stock options being the end-all be-all are realizing now you can't do that. As a matter of fact, the best companies will probably at least have 2 long-term incentives, if not 3 or 4, to make sure they're diversifying their portfolio like a good financial planner would be after the fact. We're doing it before the fact.
I look forward to having another conversation with you guys in the very near future about executive compensation trends. Been talking with Brent Longnecker and Chris Crawford of Longnecker Associates. And for WorldatWork and WorkSpan TV, I'm Ryan Johnson.